Good morning. Welcome to the Leader in Residence program with the Edmonton Public Library. I'm Valerie McNiven, and I'm chair of the Aboriginal Services team. And I'm absolutely delighted this morning to introduce our Leader in Residence, Mr. Lewis Cardinal. I met Lewis 2 or 3 years ago. We were at a community meeting, and we were all sitting around the table. There were a few of us. And we were talking about the work that we're doing in the community as individuals and as organizations. And I'd heard of Lewis, but I'd never met him, and I hadn't heard him speak. But it came around to his turn to speak, and I found he had so much information to share. He was engaging and interesting and had a wealth of knowledge. And I thought, I need to catch up with him afterwards. And over the last 3 years, we've met for coffee quite a few times. And it's always been really interesting conversations. He's also met with the Aboriginal Services team. He's been very generous with his time. He's answered all of our questions. He's open, he's been transparent, and he is also a fascinating storyteller. So Linda Garvin, our team sponsored, mentioned having him for our Leader in Residence program, and I was absolutely thrilled. And I asked Lewis again if he would come and do this, and he said, sure, no problem. So it's just wonderful. Lewis's work has mirrored his personal vision of a socially just and responsive society. He has a long track record of public service. He's received a number of awards, including the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Medal for public service, the Inspired Award for public service, and which is the highest award given to Aboriginal people by Aboriginal people, among many other awards, like I said. So without any more hesitation, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Lewis Cardinal.
Thank you, Valerie. I appreciate that warm welcome. And I just want to thank you all for coming out fairly early in the day, and hopefully I'll be able to share some things with you. It's a pretty broad topic. But before we get started, I just want to acknowledge that we're on Treaty 6 territory, home of the Cree Dene, a traditional gathering place of the Métis, and also the Stoney as well. So, and I want to welcome you all to what I call Monto, which is a part of the word of Edmonton, which speaks to the divine essence that permeates all things. So I was asked to speak on a very large subject, understanding Aboriginal people and community. So that could take a very long time. But I was thinking about that in terms of what really, where do we start when we start talking about the Aboriginal people and community? Where is a good place to start? And I've done some speaking on this, but what I found that works best is when we start to understand the foundations of Indigenous worldviews and how Indigenous people have traditionally oriented themselves to the reality that we live in. But also tying that then to a bit of Aboriginal, a very brief history of Aboriginal relations in Canada. And then I'll bring it back to Aboriginal people in Edmonton today. So we'll get started with that. And I do apologize. It's going to be a bit of a brain dump. There's going to be lots of information here. But hopefully you'll hold tight until about 10 o'clock. And then we'll have some questions. So no questions are silly. Just please feel free to ask whatever question is on your mind. I hope that this works. Nope. Here we are. Okay. Understanding Indigenous people's way of knowing and relationship. Now, the word Indigenous is being utilized more regularly now by Indigenous people in Canada. And I prefer to use that word for a number of reasons. First of all, the definition comes from the Latin indigenous, which means born of the land or springs from the land. But it also has that spiritual context of in relationship to. And it's all about relationships and being connected and interconnected. So Indigenous is being shaped by your relationship to the greater reality in terms of your spiritual traditions in relation to the larger circle of life. Most, if not all, Indigenous people recognize that we are connected to something greater than ourselves, and that we are only a part of something greater than ourselves. So we are not in the center. We are not androcentric in putting our humanity in the center or on top of all creation. Rather, we are only but one circle, one part of the circle of this great mystery that we call life. Indigenous also is utilized and has been identified by Indigenous people from around the world in the creation of the Indigenous Peoples Convention. They spent years identifying what word we wanted to call ourselves. So Indigenous then becomes the word of choice. And so as we're moving along now, a lot more agencies are calling themselves Indigenous because of that unique relationship, and because we are born of this land, and a lot of our cultures and traditions are shaped by that close relationship to the environment and Mother Earth and the cosmos. Within Indigenous worldviews, we also know that there is more to reality than meets the eye, that there is a spiritual component, that we recognize the spirit world that surrounds us, but also the spirit that is within us as well. We are, as some would say, a spirit being having a human experience, and we recognize that within that we are a part and connected to the Creator. That's why ceremonies are really important. Ceremonies are there to help us to maintain that balance in relationship to everything else. Because as they say, everything in creation is sacred, created from Mother Earth, brought forward by the Creator, and that there is a life force in all things. Therefore, there's a requirement of respect and reciprocity within the Indigenous traditions. And again, when we go back to ceremonies, ceremonies have to be seen in a certain way as Robert's Rules of Order, but also in another way as maintaining that balance and that harmony. And that is at the center and the core of Indigenous traditions, is living in that respectful and sacred manner within all living things. And of course, we're not perfect. Human beings have a tendency to take more than they need, have a tendency to become a bit destructive, walk out of balance, affect everything around them. And so we know that in order to achieve that balance, that we have to, as elders have said, walk in a sacred manner. And what is that sacred manner? Well, that sacred manner is, again, about that respect and acknowledging that there is life in everything. And when you position yourself from that, you start to build in that context of respect in everything that you do. We recognize that there is life and life force in everything around us. This podium, for example, this microphone, comes from Mother Earth. Therefore, I have to have a responsibility in order to be respectful for that, and be able to treat it more respectfully. Because what we do, it does have a direct effect on other people. So it's important that we recognize that. And of course, when we talk about all this interconnectivity, one of the great things that comes from our collective cultures is that whole thing of the Great Council of Life. And that we do sit as only one member of that Great Council of Life. And therefore, when you hear prayers being ended, especially in the northern parts here, you'll hear all my relations. And when we talk about all my relations, it isn't just my family relations. It's all of my relations and interactions with everything and everyone else, everything that I am related to and in relationship to as well. So at the foundation of each culture, and this is one thing that I find interesting, because I've had the chance to travel around the world and meet Indigenous people from all over the place, and even finding Indigenous people and traditional people of European descent, and finding within their cultures that ancient Indigenous tradition that's still there, that still resonates within their current cultural practices. So Indigenous then extends to all of humanity, that we are all, in fact, indigenous to Mother Earth, what has happened from the Indigenous perspective today is that a lot of us have left that balance and that rhythm that had been established by Mother Earth and the Creator. So Indigenous people today are reconnecting even stronger to that tradition, but also we're seeing around the world other cultures and traditions reconnecting with that Indigenous rhythm and way of being. So again, when we look at the foundation of many cultures today, you'll see that there is that Indigenous framework that still either exists or had existed at some time, and it sought to seek balance and harmony within their own environment as well. And so it's a relationship that is based and shaped by that deep spiritual and intellectual connection to the land, so much so that we can hear the land speak. And there are many stories that still I hear today about people being able to hear and feel the land, having that close relationship to it. And even here in Edmonton, we still have that sense of spirit in place, and the place that has spirit, that goes back in time as well. It's believed by a lot of our elders that when we reconnect spiritually to that natural force, we then start to move towards building in a balance and in a harmony, so that spirit still resonates and still comes and percolates through the land. And Edmonton itself, we'll speak a little bit about it later, but Edmonton itself is a very unique place, and it was by no accident that the city was built here, but I'll talk about that in a moment. So the Indigenous then is in relationship to a life and living that respects not only other people, but other beings, as I mentioned before, and we are not the center of all things, and neither do we really seek to control. The tradition of Indigenous leadership and community decision-making is how to live in balance. How do we take that relationship context from our cultures and apply it into governance and community decision-making that goes back to that respect and creating that space, because the circle then is all encompassing, and the circle is that metaphor, is that symbol of the one, but it also is the symbol of the collective. So we come together in that way. Each people that are sitting in this great circle of life, each nation is and has a unique relationship and needs to be respected as well. The voice, the language, and the customs of Indigenous people were given to them by the Creator. Now, it is believed within our traditions, and most Indigenous traditions that I've come across anyway, is that each person is an answer to a prayer. That each person that is sent here by the Creator is in response to a prayer that was either said from within the family, or maybe the parents, or maybe somebody from the community or the nation. So when each person is then sent, that spirit is called to this earth and sent by the Creator, we have a responsibility as a community to help nurture the gifts that are within inside that person, that young person. So child rearing becomes a very important role, because that person, each one of us, we have gifts that make us unique from each other. We have purpose here. And so as we raise our children, we move towards helping to unlock that gift that belongs not just to the child, but also to the community as well. Because when we do that job well, we will benefit by the gifts that the individual has. Also, within the context of this relationship and balance, we also see that it is not about the binary opposition, as some people would say. It's not about good or bad, black or white, or this or that, but rather it's trying to get to understand the broader picture and the complexity and the depth of any given issue of the day that is before us. And when we look at that spirit of openness, we can really start to understand issues in a deeper context. So within Indigenous traditions, when we would sit in council or we would sit in circle to analyze an issue, what we would do is that we would take a look at the issue here, but we'd invite other people to sit in council with us. And what we would do is ask them, how do you see this issue from your experience? Because the circle creates different vantage points. Because each person is unique, each person has a different vantage point in the circle, they also see the issue and can provide information from a different perspective. That is why the council process or the circle process is really important. Because as you move through the circle, you start to develop a deeper understanding, even a dimensional understanding of a given issue. For example, if we were to sit in a circle here, and in the center was an 8-sided vase, and we all went around and said, okay, well, what do you see in the vase? And so I'll say, well, I see this, I see that. But the person across on the other side doesn't see it because they don't have my vantage point. But once we start to move around the circle and we start to explain what we're seeing, we start to gain more information that is not obvious to us. And then if we go around the circle again, well, what does the vase mean? Is it half full? Is it half empty? What is the symbol of the vase? So it becomes a multi-dimensional and multi-leveled view of what the issue or what the subject may be. So in that way, we learn how to respect those cultural worldviews and not to be focused so much on severe competition. Because my position at looking from my vantage point doesn't mean it's the right position. It only means that it is a position that when combined together collectively, we make a better decision. Because all of us then can gain from that mutual beneficiality of information exchange. So the circle then, as you know, and as you see on my slide up there, is a metaphor. It's about inclusion, balance, and communication. It's the oldest human archetypal symbol that we know. We find it in ancient cave art going back 60, 70,000 years. And it represents, again, that one and that collective. Within Indigenous traditions of leadership and decision-making processes, the one and the individual are connected. So within the North American experience, for example, will put the individual rights above collective rights in most cases. And then in old communist Russia, they put the collective over the individual. But within the Indigenous worldview and tradition of seeing that balance, it's one needs the other, because the individual needs the collective. And what happens is that sometimes the collective will overtake the individual, and the individual can overtake the collective. But what helps to maintain that balance are ceremonies, the tradition of using the circle to bring us back to maintaining that balance. And in our old traditions, when we would have a council about something, we also reserve the right to not go with the flow, not to say, okay, well, that's, I agree with this. We reserve the right to step back and to step out of that decision-making process if we so chose. Because, again, that the individual has that sacred right to make their own decision, and that sacred right to express their thoughts within the circle of council. So the circle then becomes a very important part of the human tradition. And it is found in many different cultures. When you go and you visit Indigenous communities, you see the circle being expressed there, and it's expressed in many ways. On the top right-hand corner there, that's more of the Cree tradition in this neck of the woods. But if you go down south, that blue would be replaced by black. So these colors represent different directions. It becomes like a gyroscope. It becomes a roadmap, if you will, in walking the circle in harmony. And then you can apply different stories to the different colors that are there. If you're Hopi, the circle will be divided in half and then divided into thirds. And that's still talking about the mind, the body, and the spirit. Within the traditions here, we talk about the mind, the body, the spirit, and the emotions. Those four elements. And the word Cree, that is ascribed to my people, really comes from the French word Cristano. And Christano means the anointed ones or the Christian ones. It was anglicized, it was shortened to Chris in French, and then anglicized into Cree. But what we call ourselves is Nehiyaw, or Nehiyawiak, which means the people. And so that's the name that we have given ourselves. That's the denotation. The connotation of the word is a being of four parts. So it's believed that in order to live in harmony and to walk in balance, you need to have those four elements of yourself: the mind, the body, the spirit, and the emotions being in balance. If you spend too much time in books and you're not respecting the wellness of your own body, you will come out of balance. So there's always that element of wholeness. And the holistic worldview is found throughout Indigenous nations all over the place that speak about that as well. Even the yin and yang symbol is about balance and harmony, but it's again referring back to that ancient tradition and knowledge of the circle. So I just want to, okay. So even within our culture and our architecture, the circle is there. When you look at teepees, for example, it's a circle that starts from the ground and transitions and actually goes up into the spirit world. That connection of the circle is in relationship to the sky and ourselves. Our sweat lodges are done in circles as well. So the Indigenous worldview then has that foundational structure in everything that it does, even within our governance and especially within our art and our philosophy, and recognizing how everything goes in a circle, follows the sun. Everything is done in a particular way to respect the nature of our reality. Within the community of the nations, as I spoke before, each person has a unique voice and a right to speak and to be heard. And even families within Indigenous communities are also seen as to be unique elements in themselves, and that each family has unique gifts and ways of presenting themselves. And in some nations, particular families are given certain responsibilities to carry out in terms of ceremonies, oral histories, and that sort of thing, because of their relationship and the recognition by the community for this family to have those responsibilities within itself. And of course, then that expands even further into clans, especially when we look to the West Coast and how clans are divided up and carrying out certain responsibilities. But all these clans within the nation are required to work together. So not one clan knows everything, but one clan knows something in particular, and then it's combined with other Indigenous nations to tell the story of their people. So within the governance tradition of the use of the circle and the council and the process of council, each group, for example, my family, when we do have council from time to time, and that's more of my extended family, and they will ask either myself or somebody else to bring their concerns forward to the chief and council, for example, and to say, well, here are our issues, this is the concerns that we have, but we will select the person best suited for that position, for that role of being the speaker in that particular given subject. I am not a lawyer by training. My specialty is more education. So, I'll be asked to go and speak on an education issue. But I do have relatives that are lawyers, and so we'll ask them to go and speak based on their abilities. So the community then, within the traditional council system, would be invited to come and listen to these things, but also a way of keeping your representatives in line as well, because you want to make sure that the person who is speaking is given that room to speak, but also not to step beyond that limitation. When you do, there's this process that is called, what is it called again? It's called recall. So if I am stepping beyond my bounds and making decisions and saying things that I have not been given authority for, then I can be recalled from that leadership and somebody else will be brought in there. Because one of the great teachings is that we are given trust by the community when we are asked to do something. So you have a very serious role to play in carrying that out. So then when we come together in council, and consensus is a very important part of this. Consensus really is the ceremony of communication in this regard, and how we work together to build a consensus around a particular action or activity that the community is making or the family is making. But by doing that, what you're doing is that consensus is also a healing process as well. And this is what we found to have worked very well, and we've used it in a contemporary case here in Edmonton, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. So, but back to the council process, and of course, is to keep balance and fairness within the community and to create that sense of a common vision and working together. So when I talk about the consensus, the dialogue then becomes really important prior to going to council. So in other words, you don't come to council and just, have a consensus dialogue, but it's about talking with the community, talking about the family and the people that you represent to find out where they're at on issues, or maybe to move your own idea forward and saying, you know what, I got this wonderful idea for this program or this initiative, and I want to share that with you. And the important thing of doing that dialogue process is that you get the input from the people directly, and suddenly your great idea can be either strengthened by the input of other people or torn apart because it doesn't make any sense to anybody but yourself. And so that part of relationship building then is that part of the consensus building and how you go to the community and you talk about issues. And again, we did practice this here in Edmonton with some great results. But by honoring those voices and honoring the natural leadership that was within a community brings strength to the community, and decisions tend to be a lot more, they have longevity to them and a lot more strength to them. And as things change, you go through the same process again. So then each voice, again, adds to the council, to the wisdom of the council and the community, and it allows that differing perspective. And again, back to that point of consensus, that communication then becomes very key in how we keep each other informed, especially when we're dealing with conflict resolution. And conflict resolution, utilizing the circle process, seeks out to find an answer to the problem, and that takes time. The dialogue process does take time, but once the process is practiced, it can go very, very quickly. Within the perspective of leadership, leadership is, within a lot of Indigenous traditions, seen as a burden because it is a requirement. As my grandfather would say, it is a fool who seeks to be leader, because it is a responsibility that is very heavy, and you have to be a particular kind of person to be in that road, but it's bestowed by people. Like within our community, we have the always ongoing conversation about, well, who is an elder or who is a leader? It's the community that identifies its leaders and identifies its elders, because there's no one specific definition, but a leader can be seen as someone who knows or has the experience in a particular area. That is why you can have different kinds of leaders within a community. It all depends on what the situation is. But it is established by role model and behavior. So the community knows who their leaders are. There's formal leadership, the elected office, and then there's informal leadership by people who have demonstrated a unique set of abilities to do something and be successful at it. So we turn to them. And within Aboriginal communities, if you're to go to a First Nation, I always recommend going to the chief and council first to let them know that you're there with a request. And who are the elders that excel in these particular areas? Who would I talk to? And so that way, they recognize, okay, well, you need this kind of person who has this kind of experience, because not elders are generalists. They can be quite specific in some of their knowledge bases. So by asking that question to the community in a broad way, you get a fairer sense of who the elders are in the community, but also who are leaders in particular areas within the community as well. Because this is the aspect of merit-based or meritocracy within this tradition. And so, again, back to the leadership point, is that a leader traditional leader identified by the community is someone who is imbalanced with themselves, generally speaking. But, human beings as they are tend to be flawed at times, and I'm not talking about the whole chief and council system now, but traditionally within our communities, leadership was seen as someone who was able to walk that path in balance and seeking to better the community and not just themselves. The ceremonies then are a part of us connecting to that spiritual strength, because it requires that. Ceremonies are very unique in helping to focus thought and helping to reaffirm for yourself who you are and what it is that you're trying to do, but also seeking that spiritual counsel from the spirit world and giving you a direction and a guidance to ensure that you are doing what you are doing for the right reasons. And of course, within the young leadership that grows up, we find that a practice that is quite common is when young potential leaders are identified, that they're given a challenge, something to do to carry out for the community, and they're measured. And a women's council or a group of Indigenous women will say, well, let's ask so-and-so to do this project and see how they carry it out. So that becomes a bit of a test. And as my grandfather taught me, he said, the greatest thing that you'll ever be asked by the community is to do something and to carry it out. Because what they're saying as well is that you are being respected for what you do. And you're being respected and trusted to carry something else out. And of course, that leads to the whole thing of being consistent and committed to what it is that you're doing. And I like to talk to I have a few cousins that are chiefs, and I like to remind them that chief is a French word for the head of something. In Cree, chief is Okimaukan, which means pretend leader or leader-like. So if you're the national chief, no, I won't go there. But Okimaukan is what Okimau is what we call a leader in our traditional language. And the kan part means pretend like, because it's the Indian Act that imposed these structures on us. Today, the Indian Act still carries out a lot of governance directives for how First Nations are to govern themselves. And it is the law of the land. In most cases now, you cannot have a traditional governance on a First Nation because it is against the Indian Act, which is the legislative piece that controls all these things in First Nations communities. But the leader and the leadership council is about keeping the people together and moving in a common direction, and the ability to listen to the voices and to be able to create that space for thought to be expressed. And it's much like a hunter and a gatherer. Leadership is about being able to recognize the subtle shifts in the environment, being able to see what is happening by the relationships that are out there. So it's very much a process of observation. But the power does belong to the community. And when we think of power as a snowshoe, when you are working within this consensus process, it is able to carry and lift you over uncertain territory. Like a snowshoe, distributing the weight. Leadership within an Indigenous community is also based on building on the strengths of the community, because not one person has all the answers. So you need to look at the natural leadership that is in your community and ask them to carry out these responsibilities as well. And therefore, that part of the part of the Creator that plays in us is that light, is that spirit that we come down here with. And what is believed by most Indigenous communities is that we carry that light of the Creator within us. And when we sit in council and we do ceremony in a good way, and we walk in that sacred manner, we bring our light together in a council, and that light then joins together, and it creates a sphere of possibility. And when we create that sphere of positive energy, then the Creator sits with us, and we can hear, and He can hear what we have to say. And our ancestors, it is believed, gather around us as well when we are sitting in council. And one of my favorite quotes comes from Arnold Krochow from Tsutina. He talks about the Indian or Indigenous tradition. Authority comes directly from the Great Spirit to the people, and the Great Spirit can tell each person how to live in harmony with all its creation. That relationship is vital to an Indian. Maybe if we could share this experience with all races in this land, and if we all each day took time to get direction from the Great Spirit, we could together find a new direction for the future. And the key for me has always been, it's all about relationships. And in working with the many elders that I have here in the city, but also across Canada and in other parts of the world, they said, you know, it seems that we're in a time where we have forgotten how to have relationships. And that's a part of the process that we're trying to recover, is how do we reach out and develop relationships? And how do we listen to each other again? And how do we work together again for a common vision? And so these things then all revert back to having those relationships in the respect of all my relations. Children within Indigenous communities, as I said before, were sent by the Creator in response to the prayer. So it does become the responsibility of us all to raise a child within the community, to be observant, to make sure that resources and proper attention is provided by our youth and our children, because they truly are the answer to the future for us. Physically punishing a child was strictly taboo. Again, if you're living in that context of the sacred spirit that is sent here, then beating on your child was not a part of that rearing technique. It was role modeling appropriate behavior, utilizing other people as examples and how to behave within your community, but also through ceremonies and how to be respectful through those processes as well. And the child also had a role within the society too. So they had purpose and function. The children weren't just merely to be looked after, but also they were given responsibilities to carry out. So the child then has a sense of purpose and function at a young age, and a role to play within the different aspects of the society. And of course, elders were respected and honored as the old ones. They are, in fact, the connection to the past, and that past helps us to move forward. Elders, as I said before, are identified by the community by the skills and the merit of who they are and what they've done and demonstrated throughout their lives. It is their knowledge that's really important, and it's important also to connect the elders with the youth as well, so that they can transfer that knowledge appropriately. So the age thing of being an elder is not really the issue. It's the knowledge and the base of the individual themselves. But also, women were central to Indigenous communities. 95, 96%, I think it was estimated, of Indigenous nations in North America were gynocratic. And what that means is they were women-centered, because women are the creators of our nation. They emulate Mother Earth, and they have a very special and sacred place. The Indian Act comes in and starts to identify Indigenous women as property. And that shift then took us away from the sacred place that they play in our communities. In many Indigenous nations, it was the women who selected the leaders. In many Indigenous nations, it was women who were sought first for counsel on particular issues. And again, referring to my grandfather, who was chief of my First Nation for many years, he said, it is the women who know what the needs are in the community. It is the women who know the children, they know the elders, they know what the issues are. So if you're wise, you will listen to what the women have to say, because they have their finger on the pulse of the community. They know what's happening. So listen to what they have to say. So that's our tradition. That's how we used to be. But as we've moved away from our cultural norms and how we apply them in our Indigenous traditions, we see, the rise in family violence and violence against women, and the whole issues of murdered and missing Aboriginal women as well, because we've lost that respect. And in a sense, and I'll speak for my own male population, is that we've forgotten how to have relationships in that deep way, even with our own women. But we need to be able to return back. If we go back to ceremony and culture and have access to these cultural resources, we then again will learn how to walk in a sacred manner. So that first part, excuse me, that first part was largely just talking about the foundations of Indigenous worldviews and how it's set, and how it sets Indigenous people within that context, how it was, how we governed governed our communities, and how we worked together. The relationships between Indigenous nations were not always warlike. But again, as being human beings and nations, it's not ideal, but that sets a direction in which we go to try to live in balance and in harmony. But going back to just some practical things here about before contact, in North America, there's an estimated 100 million people, some say 112 million people in North America. Family size was an average of 2. That's coming from anthropologists. At the time, we had fixed communities, villages and towns. On prairie life, it was more nomadic or more circular, I would say, because there were certain places that nations would go to. So it wasn't they were just walking around looking for the buffalo. They actually knew where the buffalo were because they understood the balance and the cycle in life. So, but what they would do, and it kind of makes all kinds of sense, is that Indigenous nations who were considered nomadic actually were following a process of living in balance. So you would live in one place for a while, and once you start to deplete the resources in the area, you move to another one, and you move to another one. That's why we'd have fishing camps, we'd have hunting camps, we'd have different places where we would go and live our life. But from an outside point of view, it might look nomadic that way, but in fact, it was fairly well thought out. We had cross-continental trails and waterways. Indigenous people had this habit of visiting each other. They knew where everyone was, and of course, the waterways, like the North Saskatchewan River here, were like our highways at the time, but also there were foot trails all over. Yellowhead Trail, for example, the highway, actually follows an old Indigenous trail. Most cities that are built today in Western Canada, for sure, and I think also in the rest of Canada, were places where Indigenous people came and traded and did business. Ottawa, for example, means the trading place. Toronto means the meeting place. And so there were well-established trading routes and centers, and also now we're starting to see cross-oceanic trading routes and connections. And having conversations with some of my Polynesian friends, they have demonstrated how they used to come and trade as far up as Prince Rupert in trading routes. And what's the interesting thing is that we have within bundles and some of the burial mounds in Ohio, we have uncovered these long strings of shells that were called the Cyprium monidus, or the cowrie shell, the money cowrie shell. And the cowrie shell was the first form of currency used by human beings, and we could trace it to a particular place where the Cyprium monidus grows. The Cyprium monidus grows particularly in the Fiji Islands area, out towards Indonesia. That's the only place where it grows naturally. But here we are finding these cowrie shells that were used as currency in North American burial mounds that go back thousands of years. And also being found in sacred bundles that were taken from this area as well. So the only way they could have gotten here was by having transoceanic trade routes and connections along the way as well. And we know the Basque also were coming into the Grand Banks, but also into the Hudson's Bay as well, and pursuing whales and other fishing traditions. So it's not this idea that we were living in a vast tract of wilderness where there was no one here. There were actually very sophisticated societies with high technologies and large population centers that were trading very, very much with each other all over North America. And the interesting, with the Basque, one of the funerary sites that were uncovered in Labrador, actually they uncovered an Innu whaler that was holding a Basque whaling harpoon. And also there's songs and oral histories from the Churchill River Cree about these people coming to chase the white whale, and they have these ancient songs about that exchange as well. We had, of course, sophisticated government structures, decision-making processes, the use of clans, societies, and council. I talked a little bit about that already. But we also had policing, justice, diplomacy, and medicine and healing practices. And today, about 70% of pharmaceuticals that are bought over the counter were created by Indigenous horticulturalists and medicine people here in the Americas. So the contribution to medicine has been significant and often not recognized for what it is. But also, again, diplomacy. When you have over 500, 600 different nations within North America, there has to be a strong diplomatic function and process. And we used to make treaties with these different nations long before we made treaties with Europeans. So the tradition of treaties and treaty making really does predate European contact significantly. One of the examples of the treaties of peace, or the Iroquois Great Law of Peace, is a treaty. We have the 6 nations that had come together in treaty to support each other, to protect each other. Treaties were created not at the end of wars in our traditions, but rather before war happened. And that was our tradition. When we saw that there was an imbalance or conflict happening amongst Indigenous nations, we would then move towards seeking a treaty with them. Now, again, other nations, they do get into wars from time to time and have, but they weren't total extermination wars as well. The Blackfoot and the Cree, we used to be so close together that the Cree language is found within the Blackfoot language as well. And there's this old tradition that has resurrected itself where Blackfeet and Cree are still, we still have a treaty process by families adopting each other. I've been adopted into the Chief Moon family down south. And so the unique thing about that is when you talk about diplomacy, what would happen if the political leaders didn't have what we call back channels today? And also understanding that the tradition of family within Indigenous communities is you do not make war upon your family. So when we adopt each other, we're making family. And so when there is political conflict or a resource struggle, I'm able to open up a dialogue with that family in order to bring forward a more positive resolution to it as well. So the treaties then become the restoring of relations and relationships. And of course, confederacies existed not just amongst the Iroquois, but also all over North America as well. So we were mainly egalitarian in recognizing the equality and recognizing that women were a central part of governance, and men and women's roles were equal. So when I mentioned gynocratic, it didn't mean that women were in a domination role. Actually, it's a role that is central, but also the males have roles and responsibilities as well. And one of the issues that we're facing today as Indigenous men is remembering what the roles and responsibilities we have as Indigenous men to our own communities. And that's a part of some of the issues that we're dealing with today as well. So we also have elders playing an advisory and senatorial role, oral tradition about roles and responsibilities, and it's always been understood that within any community, a role and responsibilities for people is very important. We need to know where we are. We need to know how we fit in to the community. Because when you don't have that sense of connection and function and purpose within a community, you're also not being honored and respected for the value that you have as an individual. So it's important within our traditions, the oral histories and the ceremonies always taught us about how to play our role responsibly. Went in the wrong direction, I think. Okay. We also had formal forms of education. In a lot of nations, there was age and gender-specific groups. We called them teaching lodges, that sort of thing. The Mi'kmaq is an example in how how they would acquire their skills and their ceremonies. Young men, young women societies were utilized a lot, particularly by Plains people and Eastern peoples as well. It was a way in which you were within a cohort. And within those young men and young women societies, you were taught by older men and older women your role and your responsibility and how you contribute to the community in a positive way. And the YMCA based itself off of that. Girl Scouts, Boy Scouts, all that was modeled on the tradition of the young men, young women societies, and how you look after yourself, mind, body, spirit. How do you take care of yourself? How do you acquire the skills to be successful in your community? So I think that alone in and of itself is a positive way in which we can reconnect with our youth today. And I think that the more that we do that, the more that we're able to teach our young people how they fit in and what role they are within the community. The existence and evidence of written languages. Now, this is one of my favorite subjects because we know in most public school curriculum nowadays that Aboriginal people are oral. And, well, yes, that is true, but we have to look at orality in a different way. Because when Europeans made contact with North American Indigenous people, they too were oral. It was the elite that had the writing traditions and the techniques. The people who were in the galleys of the boats and doing the sailing didn't always write, didn't have that. But the very strong sense of orality and the tradition of storytelling and knowledge exchange through that was done through pretty much the same way Indigenous people were doing it. And also, we had written languages already existed. And I know some of the current scholarship on that recognizes that James Evans, when he was here in Edmonton, had actually written in the Meshebegwidong journals, in his own journal, saying that the written form was already here. What he did is he took the symbols and organized them into a Roman orthography so they could be studied, and so that the Indigenous language here can be studied. And what's interesting about Cree and the syllabary here in Edmonton is that it went on to inspire the Moon Code. It's like the Braille type writing that was created in England, came directly from these Cree syllabics. Also, the Cree syllabics then were used to help devise a written language for Chinese tribal people. So there was a significant connection to Indigenous symbols. Now, these symbols were used in ceremony, and they were used as healing as well. And another form of that is the Mi'kmaq writing tradition. The Mi'kmaq scrolls, there's scrolls in birch bark that still exist in museums like the Field Museum, the American Museum of Natural History. And these, again, predate European contact, but the symbols are there and they're utilized. The Lene Lenape, or the Lenape as they like to be called, they have the Wallam Olam, which is a history, a record, the red record or the history. They wrote that in a pictograph type form on a series of sticks and bundles of sticks that they would write on that recorded their migration from the land of ice, which is believed to be northern Alberta during the ice sheet age. And so they came out of the land of ice, and then they migrated down south and over to the eastern seaboard. So they have this book called the Wallam Olam, which tells that migration. And how that connects to Edmonton is that it still talks about inventing the written language in this area. We had, myself and another colleague of mine had a chance to go and do our research presentation to the annual history summit of the Lenape a few years back. And they confirmed for us that they believe that they invented their written language here in the Edmonton area maybe a couple thousand years ago. So there's another tie-in to writing and connection with other Indigenous people there as well. And of course, you know, some of us know the codex, the Aztec libraries, hieroglyphics and paintings and different pictorial replications and things like that. So there was that concept of writing, and it existed, and so now it's starting to come out more openly that yes, these things did exist as well. So our trade relations, again, were a very large part of life as well. We had, again, Vikings, Basque, and Chinese is now starting to come out as evident that they did travel here. The Chinese is interesting because they actually have, when one of the explorers came over in these large armadas, they brought artists with them. And these artists painted coastal sea life of indigenous communities that goes back to about 1421 or something like that. And so that connection is known to have been made, again, with the Vikings. We all know about Vikings coming here and that sort of thing. So it wasn't an absent land. It was actually a continent that had a lot of connection with it. And of course came the French, the Dutch, the English. Within the early traditions of our people, we also started to form trading alliances, and that was important for us. And of course, different nations of people would take different alliances with different people. The Wendat or the Huron with the French, the Iroquois with the English, that sort of thing. Because again, when we made trading alliances with each other, it was a treaty relationship, and that we would protect each other's relationship that we had in order to ensure that there was prosperity that would continue. And of course, one of the first treaties was called the Two-Row Wampum. And of course, that was always about strengthening trade and prosperity. And for 200 years, the fur trade existed in relationship to Aboriginal people. It was necessary, especially with the Cree out in the west and northern Ontario. It was important for the Cree in terms of being the middle people in the trading thing as well. So perspective is really important here. At the time, there was value, there was relevance to Indigenous people's relationship with the newcomers, and that we needed to have protection from our adversaries. And also it was to ensure that, again, the trade was maintained. So it was necessary at that time to have that relationship. For over 200 years, the trading tradition was shared between Indigenous and non-Indigenous. 1763, the Royal Proclamation kind of extends that. It recognizes that Indigenous peoples are nations, and that it's nation-to-nation government, or governments that is necessary in order to make treaties. So it recognizes Indigenous peoples' title to lands, and that only the government can buy land or make treaties. Establishes a process for obtaining land. Treaties are part of the Canadian framework, and it guarantees Aboriginal rights. So this document, going back 1763, has been upheld in our Supreme Courts over and over again. This becomes the bedrock and the foundation of Indigenous law, constitutional law, and the very foundation of Canada itself. Of course, terra nullius was the whole concept of the empty land. And a part of this process then is going to the perception that we are starting to be looked at as being problems. And Indigenous people were not civilized. So for 200 years, we were sharing in the bounty of the land, and then things start to shift. The free land was opened again, or to be improved. But the problem with that is that there were Aboriginal people living on it at the time, and so that started to create a lot of issues. So it became a problem, and that problem then started to take more of a negative turn, particularly in the War of 1812. The War of 1812 then becomes a very pivotal year in Canadian history. This is where the relationship between Indigenous people and the rest of Canada really starts to take that negative turn. There were two things that were born at that time at the end of the war. It was the birth of Canada and the birth of the Indian problem, because suddenly the relevance of Indigenous people was not apparent. We have secured this land. What are we going to do now? We really don't need the Indigenous people anymore. So the relationship really starts to change. And then we start to see how the trade started to be affected. The economies of Indigenous communities started to collapse as well. And so there's this attitude of starting to isolate Indigenous people away from the rest of Canadians, because the birth of these ideas, the noble savage, the dying race, really started to make itself known. So this attitude then lends support to the idea, well, the land is there for the taking, and that manifest destiny and all these other ideas start to percolate through that time. But then colonization really starts to kick in. Well, what's the answer, and how do we deal with Indigenous people? Well, we colonize them. We force them into becoming a lot like who we are. So this really begins in the 1840s. The legal intentions really became clear through a series of legislations. And we see the treaty process starting to be really enacted now. And how do we open up the rest of the country? Well, the Royal Proclamation teaches us and shows us that the government has to make treaty with Indigenous people. So, within that, there are certain rights that we had kept for ourselves: hunting, trapping, etc. But what happens is that Indian policies then start to take shape. We are seen as wards or children of the state, so the government oversees everything that we do. The Gradual Civilization Act, 1857, is the first composition of bringing together legislation under one banner. And of course, when Canada, was formed in 1867, following that was the Gradual Enfranchisement Act of 1876, which then leads to the Indian Act in 1876. And it becomes very clear that the process that's being engaged is the forced assimilation of Aboriginal people, moving them away from their culture, their traditions, their form of governance, even raising their own children. And the idea was to remove Indigenous people from their cultural traditions, and therefore you would do that by removing the children from the parents. So that became the whole history of the residential schools. Cultural expressions were made illegal. Ceremonies like the Sundance and the potlatch, we couldn't get together in numbers greater than 12. We couldn't buy or sell goods, produce, harvest livestock without permission or through the Indian agent. We couldn't vote or leave the reserve. There was a pass system. We had to have permission to leave our reserves. But another thing people don't know is that if you were non-Aboriginal or non-First Nations, you had to get permission to go on a reserve as well. It was illegal for you to be on, and it was illegal for us to be off. So, and that existed up to 1951. And of course, we couldn't have legal representation until 1951 as well. Because if we are wards of the state, the rationale was the government has our best interest at hand. So, and of course, if we got too educated, anything more than grade 8, either we went to a seminary to get higher education, or we lost our rights as status people. And what that meant at the time is that if you lost your status rights, that means that you couldn't go back to the reserve. And so that's where all your family was at the time. So you weren't allowed to return there. And a lot of people had to endure that separation as well. And even if we made too much money, we would lose rights. And that was done by fiat through Indian affairs. So that's just two quick points about where we were, where we've gone, and now we have a bit of where we're at today. As I was mentioning earlier, this was a great gathering place. Edmonton was known as Pehonan, which means waiting place. It's about 8,000 to 10,000 years old, right to the end of the very last ice age. Rossdale Flats was that gathering place. When we were doing research on the early history, the term Pehonan comes from the elders of Saskatchewan. In the Saskatchewan Power study on the drainage of the Saskatchewan River, they identified all these different gathering places that they called Pehonan, which means the waiting place. This is where people came and did ceremonies. Edmonton was known as one, and it was a noted one as well. But they came for trade, ceremony, and celebration. Many Indigenous nations, the Yakima from Washington State, came here. The Sioux, Mandan, different nations used to come here and trade. And it was known as a medicine trading place even back then, where different herbs and things would be traded. What used to govern that whole area was something that we called Wechituan. And some of our Indigenous scholars in governance talk about Wechituan. It literally means helping each other. But that's the denotation. The connotation is relationship and how we work together to help and better the place. And of course, the spirit of place and the spirit in place here, we still believe as Indigenous people that spirit still gathers here. What is the spirit of Edmonton, as I would say? Well, it's the nature of working together. And when you look at the history of Edmonton, we see so much social firsts, a lot of unique things that are tied to the spirit of this place. Like I said, the medicine trading tradition of Edmonton is now expressed through the great medical facilities that we had. And when we met here to trade, we also traded in knowledge, in education, in knowing. And we have fine education systems here as well. It was a place of commerce, and of course Edmonton now is a great commerce place. Today and this is an argument I'm making, technically within the city of Edmonton there's about 67,000 Aboriginal people in the geographic borders of Edmonton. But when you draw a commuting distance of 1 hour from the city, and you encapsulate the 4 bands to the south, the 4 bands to the east, Sherwood Park, St. Albert, you're looking at a population of just over 100,000 Aboriginal people. So instead of getting lost in the idea that, well, we have to wait till 2017 when suddenly we're the largest urban Aboriginal population, actually we are already. There are so many people around us that are using Edmonton on a daily basis, and that's just the permanent residences. We're not taking into account that a lot of people are coming from the north, especially northern Alberta, northwestern Saskatchewan, northeastern British Columbia, are coming here on a regular basis, utilizing services and people from the north, the Yellowknife and that. This becomes a central place. So we have to recognize that already we have the largest urban population in Canada. And of course, there's already over 70 different unique Indigenous nations, again, carrying that spirit of still gathering and coming together. A young population, 50% is under the age of 25, about 45% are Métis, but they're not centered all in one location. So you don't have, like Winnipeg would have a particular part of town that's all Aboriginal. The interesting number is that no number in the city rises above, I think it's 15% in neighborhoods of Aboriginal people. What we see is that they're scattered throughout all the communities in Edmonton. So we're living in different areas. And about 65 Aboriginal service agencies are here, and it's still a place of governance. Treaty 6, Treaty 8, Métis Nation, we have our governance here. We also have the legislature and that sort of thing. But there is a cultural resurgence. More Indigenous people are looking to their past to find out more about themselves and who they are and how they can live in a more of a traditional mind frame. And then also a desire to look back to that relationship tradition of how we maintain ourselves in the city, because we're starting to take our place. Now, I ran for city council back in 2007. In the last election, I think we had 4 Aboriginal people who put their name forwards to run in the last election. So now we're taking that step forward to say, okay, we are going to take our place. We have people sitting on different different councils within the city as well. So our presence is starting to fit in and working towards building a positive relationship with the rest of Edmontonians. In 2005, we developed something called the Edmonton Declaration, strengthening relationships between Aboriginal people and the city of Edmonton. That became the benchmark, according to the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, as the new benchmark for urban Aboriginal relations in Canada. And it caught the attention of the United Nations, UNESCO, and UN Habitat, where they were having an international conference in Chile around Indigenous migrations to urban centers. Because what they found is the numbers almost mirror our numbers here in Canada, where 72% of First Nations are not living in their community. They're actually living in urban centers. And so that's reflected internationally as well. They said, what are we going to do? You have all these Indigenous people coming. Well, they said, hey, we hear Edmonton's doing something. So they invited us down there to talk about the declaration and to talk about the Edmonton Urban Aboriginal Accord Relationship Agreement. This set for us then the foundation, and it was a set of principles that we went to the community and said, okay, what are your issues, what are the priorities and the concerns? And we went and did utilizing the consensus and the talking circle process. We went out to about 2,500 Aboriginal people and about 700 non-Aboriginal people. We found out later because people were filling out the forms and they didn't identify themselves. And that's an interesting story in itself. But so we went out and we asked them, what are your issues, priorities, and concerns? And if we were to develop a relationship agreement with the City of Edmonton, what are the principles that you want to see in these things? So we went through a process of collecting that information, writing it out, bringing it back to the community again and saying, okay, did we hear this right? Did we get it right? So we use that consensus process in a way that hadn't been used in this kind of scale before. But we went back, and each time the community would give their consent and say, yes, okay, now you got it right. Now you bring it forward. Even when we drafted the Accord Relationship Agreement, we worked with existing community leaders and organizations and other things to saying, are we getting this right? So we moved that forward then, and that's really set a very strong foundation now for Edmonton to take its place as a leader in urban Aboriginal relations or urban Indigenous relations. That's allowed us to develop other projects that have come out from that as well. We developed the Wachituin, which is our urban governance structure, utilizing clan and council system decision-making. The first of its kind in Canada. We've developed the Aboriginal Relations Office, again, the first of its kind in Canada, in where the Aboriginal Relations Office then acts as a bridge between the Aboriginal community and the corporation of the City of Edmonton as well. And from that, we've been able to see and generate some unique projects. The Spirit of Edmonton is something that I'm heading up right now, which consists of 8 different projects that are focused on the River Valley. One of the key things that we have uncovered is that we need to have more cultural reflectivity of Indigenous people here in Edmonton. We just simply don't have enough. When we have the largest urban Aboriginal population and we're still not seeing ourselves within the city itself. So these projects, these 8 projects, which includes the Indigenous Peoples Experience at Fort Edmonton. That is a project, that's about a $50 million project. We're going to recreate, it's called Spirit of Pehonan, and we're going to flesh out more of the Indigenous story throughout the whole park. And we're going to have a unique addition to the park that will be somewhat of a recreation of Pehonan, the different nations coming together pre-contact. We just signed an agreement, the City of Edmonton, called Kichi-Aski, which means sacred earth. And Kichi-Aski is the first cultural and ceremonial lands for Indigenous people in Canada. A place where we can go and pray and do our simplest of ceremonies, have our sweat lodges. Because right now, as a people, we're the only peoples who don't have a church, a temple, or a mosque where we can go and pray. We actually have to leave town, leave the city in order to do these things. But now the city, after 6 years, spinning the city on a dime, we finally have that agreement in place. And now we're starting to have ceremonies and programming the space and that sort of thing. And that's at Fox Farms. I don't know if some of you know where that is, but it's on Fox Drive and where the White Mud meets Fox Drive. To the south there, it's embraced by this river, White Mud Creek Valley. So those are some of the things that we have moving forward. I'll just leave that like that. And I know that, and I think I hit it on time, pretty much. But anyway, sorry, thanks. And that's in a nutshell. I really thank you for your patience, and I appreciate your time and look forward to talking. If you guys have any questions, I'd be happy to try my best to answer them. Okay, sure.
For the past year or two, there was the Truth and Reconciliation tour across the country. I received a lot of media coverage, and I think it raised a lot of awareness for people. What's next? What's coming from that? Or I guess.
Well, I know, and I really appreciate Mayor Iveson and his commitment to that, and naming this year the Year of Reconciliation. And I know that the city itself is working towards developing Indigenous awareness workshops for its staff to do something that's more integrated throughout the whole system. And I think that that's a positive result from that. But I also look to the interfaith community that's doing a lot more in terms of creating the space and the opportunity for these stories to come out. And I think, some of the discussion that, I'll have a little bit later with the team here is, what does that look like within the Edmonton Public Library? But I think the important thing is creating the opportunity for knowledge to be shared. And that's really the inoculation from the lack of knowing the Indigenous story and how that colonial experience has really affected our people and carries on to this day to the form of negative legacy. So I think the more that I'm seeing the city move in this direction, the more confident I feel that, Edmonton will again provide a leadership role in addressing how is that from the, how does a city respond to that sort of thing in today's context. It's a lot of work, but I do know that there are agencies and parts of the city itself that are really moving forward to develop more opportunities for dialogue, having resources available and that sort of thing. Yes.
This might be an impossible question, but I feel compelled to ask it. If there was one thing that I could do as a librarian to be more effective at building relationships with Indigenous communities in the library, what would that one thing be?
Well, I think the key to what I was presenting is the idea of relationships. And that's reaching out individually to people that are there and approaching it in a positive, friendly manner. That I think is a sense of welcoming in how people are treated. My brother and I used to use this library all the time. It was our place to go. We grew up in the inner city here, and we were dirt poor, except without the dirt. And it was, but we had this place to come. We used to come and watch movies here, and we used to just go through the books and spend a lot of time here. And it was on a few occasions where there was some really nice staff members that made it, came and offered, are you looking for something? I'll help you, and this is how you do things, and they really have a sense of welcome. And I think that's the foundation of how you build relationships with any group of people, is to ensure that they're approached in a very positive manner. But then also creating programs within the library system itself that recognizes and shows so that our Indigenous people can see themselves as well within the library system as well.
Shy?
Okay.
I have one thing, sir.
Oh, super.
We have a lot of things in the library that are sort of branded as Aboriginal. Do you think it would be important to change the word Aboriginal to Indigenous for like different collections?
No, my perspective on that is that Indigenous is the favored term by people, but the legal aspect of that is Aboriginal is defined by the Constitution, Section 35, so that is the legal term. And that's why, we are choosing to use Indigenous more, but it also is interchanged with the word Aboriginal as well. I think that's a discussion that needs to be had in terms of what would be more respectful. But my opinion would be Indigenous is always the way to go because, it's more descriptive of what the Indigenous cultures are about. And also the fact that internationally they identified that term Indigenous as our own term for ourselves. So, but that's a really good question, and I'd like to be in on that conversation one day.
Are there any other? Yay.
Any thoughts on making workplaces welcoming and accessible?
Well, yeah, there's a number of things. I've worked in different organizations, and I think one of the important things that we found was establishing policy within the organization that respects Indigenous people and creates a grievance process that acknowledges who they are, that sort of thing. That's always a positive development to work towards. I think that opportunities need to be outlined in terms of how communication between management and the employee are carried out. But then again, that's a general statement, I think, to anyone who's involved in an organization. And again, going back and working with Indigenous people, the key is dialogue. The key is communication, creating the opportunities where people can speak without fear of retribution, and a place where they can sit and have an honest conversation about what they see is going on. And once we create those opportunities, there's a sense of connection and buy-in into the organization, rather than just being an employee and being isolated on your own. So I think that's some ways of doing that. Absolutely.
Thank you very much, Liam. This is absolutely wonderful. And it actually reminded me of the first time that we met when I heard you talking, and I thought, oh, this is wonderful.
Well, thank you.
I think we need to have him back.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Have a great day, everybody, and thanks for coming.
I forgot.